Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Rifleman. I did a thing last night. We ordered pizza, and I had a couple of shots of vodka with dinner. 3 shots of vodka with dinner and a couple of beers. But my inhibition levels were lowered to the point where I started looking around on my iPad, on the internet, at various sites that I like, and I ended up clicking the buy button around 10 o'clock last night, and I purchased another 9mm pistol. And I'm not going to talk about that. That is going to be the subject of a project that I have coming up. You're going to find out about it soon enough. It'll all become apparent in the next several weeks. But the truth is, I hate to admit this, I just laid them all out on the bed this morning to confirm. I have 9mm pistols currently, 10 9mm altogether if you count in my Ruger PC carbine. And I only shoot relatively proficiently with one of my 2 hands. So, and I know I have this channel on several different platforms. You know, I've got to keep content flowing, but I just have too many 9mm. And I'm going to get rid of 3 so that I don't end up with 11 9mm altogether. First of which is going to be my Beretta APX A1 carry. This one I'm not selling. My dad likes this quite a bit. He's been talking about buying one, and why should he go buy one if I have one that I'm really not using? All right, so that's out of the way. Now it's time to take a look at the other 2 pistols I'm going to get rid of, and they are the oldest 9mm in my collection. They're the pistols I've had for the longest period of time, and they are the least relevant. They're kind of cool pistols from a historical perspective, but they're not that cool, and I just don't shoot them at all anymore. And I'm talking about my Smith & Wesson traditional double actions. These are both second-gen guns. We've got the 459 here, and its compact sibling, the 469. These were incredibly important pistols when they came out. Today, they're virtually unseen in gun shops and things like that. There are collectors who specialize in Smith & Wesson pistols, but they just really don't fit in anymore. So I just want to take a quick look at each of them and some of the features and some of the history behind them quickly, and get some close-up shots to document the pistols before I take them down to the gun shop and put them on consignment tomorrow. So we can't really look at the Smith & Wesson 469 without first looking at the Smith & Wesson 459. As you can see, it is unloaded, nothing up the pipe, nothing in the magazine. The Smith & Wesson 469 is nothing more really than an evolution of the original Smith & Wesson 59, which was itself an evolution of the Smith & Wesson 39. You could make an argument that the 59, which was the predecessor to this pistol, was the very first Wonder 9. The 2 pistols that are generally characterized as being the first Wonder 9s are the FN GP35, better known as the Browning High Power, and the Walther P38. They were both chambered in 9mm. The Browning High Power had sort of very traditional single action lock work and a manual safety, very similar to a Colt 1911. But it also had a double stack magazine, which held, I think, 14 rounds or 15 rounds, something like that. So it had a much higher capacity than any pistol that had come before it, or any, I guess, commonly accepted pistol, commonly issued, commonly manufactured pistol that had come before it. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those here to show you. I also don't have a Walther P38, but the big deal about the Walther P38 was that it had double action, single action lock work. So you had second strike capability. It had a decocker safety, very similar to this Smith & Wesson Model 459, and the double action lock worked very similar to this Smith & Wesson 459. But the Walther P38 had a very conventional single stack magazine. I don't remember if it held 7 or 8 rounds. I've owned a couple of P38s over the years, but I don't have one anymore, and I don't have one here to show you. So each of these pistols, the Browning High Power and the Walther P38, were revolutionary in their own right. But it wasn't until, I think, 1972 that Smith & Wesson came out with the Model 59, which, again, very similar to this 459. It had a rounded trigger guard, it had simplified sights, and it had some simplified lock work. Compared to this one, there were a few upgrades made, but very, very similar to this. And it was the first pistol, the Model 59, to combine the double action lock work and the decocker, the slide mounted decocker safety of the Walther P38 with the high cap magazine, high capacity, double stack magazine of the Browning High Power. And it was an enormous success. It was an immediate success. It didn't find a lot of traction on the military market, but it really started taking the law enforcement market by storm. I'm old enough to remember the mid-1970s. I remember when your average cop on the street was carrying a double-action revolver in his holster on his Sam Brown duty belt. And it was generally chambered in .38 Special. A few guys had .357 Magnums, but most of them had a 6-shot double-action revolver, maybe a couple of speed loader holders on their duty belt, and that was pretty much it. But by the time I was in high school, most of the police you saw on the street, there were still a couple of old-timers carrying revolvers, but most of the cops you saw on the street were carrying these. Smith & Wesson already had great traction when it came to law enforcement contracts. They had been selling double-action revolvers to almost every police force and law enforcement agency in this country and many, many, many abroad for decades and decades at that point. And so when it came time to upgrade to auto-loading pistols, Smith & Wesson already had their foot in the door. And that was really the point of the success of this pistol, was these huge government contracts. There were a few military contracts that came out, but mostly it was with law enforcement. But there were some concerns about the original Model 59. And in 1984, the United States military conducted its Joint Services pistol tests. We all know that that shook out to the Beretta 92 and the SIG P226 were the two finalists. Of course, the Beretta was adopted as the M9 as the ultimate winner of that, but there was a third pistol in that trial that performed very, very well, and it was the Smith & Wesson Model 459. Smith & Wesson developed the 459 specifically to compete in those trials, and it addressed some of the deficiencies of the earlier Model 59. The 459 has improved lock work. It has improved safety. I think the firing pin safety was changed a little bit. The 459 tends to feed hollow point ammunition better than the earlier Model 59, which would generally only feed full metal jacket ammunition reliably unless you did a bunch of work polishing the feed ramp and things like that. So the 459 was definitely an improved version of the Model 59. And although they didn't win the Joint Services pistol contract, Smith & Wesson managed to sell many, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands possibly, of these pistols to law enforcement agencies all over the country. And these were really very good pistols. I'm old enough to remember going into gun shops back in the day, and I often heard this gun shop lore, oftentimes from behind the counter. Somebody's in there shopping for their first handgun, and the guy behind the counter is telling the person, Smith & Wesson makes great revolvers, but you don't want their pistols. They are utter crap. And that was simply not true. Nothing could have been anywhere near as successful as these pistols were, regardless of whether or not Smith & Wesson was great at manipulating contracts, if the gun was a piece of crap. Now, having said that, the 459, the Gen 1 Smith & Wesson pistols and the Gen 2 Smith & Wesson pistols don't have the smoothest triggers. I'll give them that. These triggers are very long and creepy and crunchy. you kind of get to a wall, and then you go past the wall, and then it breaks. The double action triggers are just not very good. The single action trigger is not bad. And one great thing about the Smith & Wesson trigger is the incredibly short reset. I mean, your finger doesn't move more than about 1/10 of an inch to reset the trigger, and you're back to a great single action pull. So these pistols were very nice. They're generally pretty nicely finished, although they were made in huge numbers, and we didn't have CNC machines back in the day. A lot of the machining that was done on these was manual, and you'll see lines that don't quite line up, things that we wouldn't accept today, but the pistols were generally very functional, reasonably accurate, and very, very durable. A lot of people have the idea that the early Glocks, like this Gen 2 Glock 17, were the first pistols to go far beyond 20, 30,000 round service life without failure. But in fact, Smith & Wesson traditional double actions really set that standard long before Glock was even on the market. I think the Illinois State Police used the 459, or maybe the model 59 that came before it, and they kept very accurate logs of how many rounds were through each individual pistol by serial number. And I think the first pistol to be officially logged as having completed more than 100,000 rounds was a Smith & Wesson 459, or maybe a 59. I don't remember exactly. You can look it up, but it's out there. And another point of interest about the Smith & Wesson 459 is it was one of the most prominently featured pistols in the infamous 1986 FBI Miami shootout, in which 2 special agents, both of whom were carrying 459s, were killed and a bunch more were injured. I think 4 special agents in all were carrying 459s as their primary duty pistols, and it was 9mm rounds out of the Smith & Wesson 459 that insufficiently penetrated one of the perpetrators, I think, collapsing his lung and filling his chest cavity with blood, but not stopping him, not knocking him out of the fight, before he was able to kill one of those 2 agents. And it was really the result, not of the performance of the pistol, but of the 9mm ammunition that the FBI was using at the time that really changed the landscape of defensive and law enforcement pistols for a generation to come. Of course, we all love the 9mm now, and it's certainly the predominant cartridge when it comes to carry pistols on the market. But less than 10 years after that shootout, you would see that most cops and a lot of private citizens were carrying bigger, heavier, more powerful pistols like this SIG P229 and 40 Smith & Wesson. As you can see, it's clear, nothing up the pipe. If you would like to educate me on how the 9mm is just as effective as the 40 Smith & Wesson, and how a 40 Smith & Wesson is unnecessarily powerful with unnecessary recoil and blah, 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 please do that in the comment section down below. The algorithm loves a healthy debate, so I look forward to your comments. But this pretty much was the standard then for another 10 or 15 years. With modern loadings and with modern bullet construction, the 9mm is a very effective round. And although the decision to go back to 9mm was largely based on cost, I have 9mm, so clearly I don't hate the 9mm. But there's no question that the 40 Smith & Wesson is a more effective cartridge. There are guys in the Northwest and up in Alaska who are carrying the 40 Smith & Wesson for bear defense. I don't think you're going to find many people carrying 9mm parabellum for bear defense. Now, of course, bear defense and defensive use against human beings are 2 totally different categories. I will concede that, but the 40 Smith & Wesson is definitely more powerful than the 9mm. But that is a discussion for a different video. One other point of interest that I overlooked about this particular Smith & Wesson Model 459, and I contacted Smith & Wesson about this just out of curiosity, and I got an entirely unsatisfactory answer from them. But this particular one, the Smith & Wesson logo here on the side of the frame, is overstamped. It's double stamped. When I look at this logo, I feel like I'm not wearing my glasses or something. It's almost impossible to make out. If you didn't know what it was, you'd be very confused. I think both of these pistols, the 459 and the 469, were imported, re-imported from Israel. They were both heavily used when I got them years and years ago. I don't know if Smith & Wesson was sort of sending factory seconds overseas, and that's why this double stamp made it out of the country and then back in, but it's kind of cool. And the second pistol I want to take a look at, very briefly, because I can see this video is getting kind of long already, is my Smith & Wesson Model 469. Luckily, as you can see, nothing up the pipe, nothing in the mag, nothing in the tube. Luckily, most everything that can be said for the 459 can be said about the 469. The 469 is kind of interesting in that it was the first factory chopped and channeled carry pistol out there. For years and years and years, companies like ASP and DeVille had been taking full-size pistols like the Smith & Wesson Model 459 and cutting a little bit off the slide, cutting a little bit off the mag well. Sometimes they would have to cut it right in the middle and put things together and weld them back together. It was a complicated process and quite expensive, but people paid a huge premium to shave just a little bit of size off of their normal carry pistol in order to have an effective concealed carry pistol. And if you look at this today, this is not exactly a compact pistol. It is very, very chunky. It's quite heavy. It's actually not much smaller than this SIG P229. They have very, very similar size, but this was considered radically small. And when these first came out, they were enormously popular. They were referred to in the gun press as Smith & Wesson miniguns. And if I recall correctly from reading articles in rags like Guns and Ammo and Shooting Times and things like that back in the 1980s, there were wait times as long as 2 years to get one of these. You'd go in, put your money down, place an order with Smith & Wesson, and then wait. It was like buying a Randall knife. But the really neat thing about the Smith & Wesson 459 was that it actually ran reliably. A lot of those custom chopped and channeled pistols did not run reliably. Many times they would have springs that only lasted like 200 rounds. So you were having to change out your recoil spring very, very frequently. And it was Smith & Wesson who developed their green recoil springs. I still have a small stockpile of those that were specifically for these compact pistols, and they last a long, long time. I've never had any serious malfunctions with this pistol, and I've shot it quite a bit. I actually shoot this pistol better than I shoot its larger sibling, the 459, despite the shorter sight radius. I've always shot this pistol better, and I'm actually kind of sad to see it go because it's one of my better shooting 9mm. But again, you can't keep everything. Both of these pistols have aftermarket grips on them. This one has Uncle Mike's rubber flat panel grips. These used to be the preferred aftermarket grip for the Smith & Wesson 59 series pistols that still had grip screws. And this one has Pachmayr signature grips, which are a wraparound in the front. You can see there's no grip screws here. The grip panels are actually held in place by the mainspring housing, which is a molded piece of polymer. It hooks in here under the beaver tail and is pinned in place down here, and it holds the grip panels on. The original grip panels that came on these miniguns would always get loose and rattly. That doesn't happen with these rubber Pachmayrs because you've got this wraparound section in the front that's kind of providing tension. These or some other sort of wraparound grip are the only way to go with these older Gen 2 compact pistols. But again, virtually nobody's going to be carrying these. one of the reasons they're going away is I'm certainly not using these pistols for defensive purposes anymore. They just don't measure up to the vast majority of the other stuff I have. And one last criticism of these pistols is the fact that they feature a magazine disconnect, which was dictated by a bunch of law enforcement agencies. Smith & Wesson capitulated. It affects the trigger pull, and unlike the Browning high power, I don't think you can just take the magazine disconnect out of these and have them work and have a better trigger. Maybe you can. If you know better than me, certainly comment down below. So I could probably go on and on and on and talk for hours about these pistols. I'm sure I've missed a whole lot of minutia, but nobody really wants to hear that. I just wanted to take a quick look at these before they go away. They were at one point in time my most used pistols, my most carried pistols, warm weather, cold weather. I use these a lot, I shot them a lot, but it's just time for them to go on down the road and find new homes. I'm going to put both of these pistols up at very, very reasonable consignment prices at my local gun store. Maybe a younger person will get a hold of them and get as much use out of them as I did. I certainly hope so. But I did just want to take a look at them before they went away. And so soon we'll get to take a look at my new 9mm, and I'll talk about the project that I plan with that, and hopefully you enjoy all of that. And when I post that up, I hope to see each of you then. Later, guys.